Hello and welcome to another video. So we're taking a look at Abyss Rune. We've covered a few Rune decks because Rune is one of the few cards that you don't need many of the new ones for, with just Vesper Witch Hunter really being the key important card, and of course the gold, which I currently don't have, but honestly you can run a lot of decks without that as well. So honestly, Vesper Witch Hunter in this deck in particular makes a big difference. I did open a third one very recently, so that's why this deck has 3 and a couple of the other videos don't. In particular, Abyss Rune does fairly well with Vesper, as you do take quite good advantage of Golem Assault and Concentration compared to my Giant Chimera deck, where you're really just using it as an extra buff, especially since you are running Witch's Cauldrons and Starseer's Telescope. I have considered dropping back on the Witch's Cauldron, maybe down to 2 and putting in something else. But outside of that, I'm not really sure where to go. I definitely would run a third Abomination if I had one, but outside of that card, I'm really not sure. So this deck does okay. I definitely still prefer Giant Chimera for consistency, but this deck holds its own fairly nicely, so we're going to get right into it and check it out. And the first one we're up against is Dragon. Dragon's become fairly popular, in particular Ramp Dragon, which is a deck I'm going to cover next, although it isn't optimized, as I will be missing a few of the new cards, which is a little disappointing. But this opening hand isn't too bad. Abyss Summoner isn't something you want now, though. You do want to be drawing it later in the game, especially considering you're going to mill half your deck. Putting Abyss Summoner back into the deck is usually completely fine. So Mysterious Knowledge is an okay turn 1, especially when you have a Flame Destroyer. It gives us a couple of different options for turn 2, but it looks like Vesper Witch Hunter is going to definitely be the best one to take. So I do have a little bit of trouble with the Abominations. I probably should just be playing them more as 6 damage Storm kind of followers because they're hard to deal with on 3. I do tend to want to use them with card draw, but that doesn't always work out. So just something to keep in mind when playing Abomination. You're nearly always better off just evoing it for 6 damage than trying to trigger its effect, unless you are guaranteed that effect basically on the play. Mysterious Missile going face. Not really much else at the moment. Dragon Lifeblade, okay. See, going here, definitely should have went for the Evo on the 6/6 instead of throwing it onto the Owl here. Well, Owl isn't a bad play because we've actually got a fairly decent spell boostable hand here, which is going to give us a lot of possible value. I still feel like the 6/6 would have just had a little bit better value going face, so really was just up in the air there. In this situation, it wasn't bad, but it definitely wasn't the best option I probably could have went with. So this gives them a very easy way to remove our 6/5 now. The Abomination just getting killed right when we don't want it to. Right as we had a chance to activate its effect, which is a little disappointing, but I mean, that happens, not much you can do. We have a pretty nice Fiery Embrace hand, and we're going to be able to drop our Flame Destroyer very early, going for 6. Of course, you can possibly drop it earlier. I've had a couple where I've dropped them on 4 or 5, but that's exceptionally rare normally. Most commonly, I'll drop them somewhere around 6 to 8. Sometimes even later if I decide I need them for a bigger swing against something like Giant Chimera Rune, for example. So our opponent really just taking things pretty casual. They haven't ramped up super hard, which is good for us, but I mean, Witch's Cauldron into Starseers is going to give us a chance at getting more cards. And I go for Witch's Cauldron, Witch Hunter, getting that out, just Vesper. Kind of tanking stuff now, as I didn't really have many other good options that I could go with. We do end up drawing another Starseer's Telescope, which with the Witch's Cauldron should work in our favour. Frenzied Drake though, kind of ruining any possible good plays I could have had. So while I have the chance to go for this Abyss, I probably should have definitely went for the Witch's Cauldron into Starseer first. But then of course I also wouldn't have then been able to play the drop there, which would have been fairly bad. So I guess killing off the Frenzied Drake was the right play. So we have 2 6/6s that have to be dealt with. Poseidon is not a bad option for our opponent here. This is going to very heavily limit what we can do next turn, but the question is, will it really be enough? I mean, a 7/3 is threatening and all, but when you've got the Starseer's Telescope, is it really that threatening? And Golem Assault is actually going to help us out. We're going to pretty easily shut down this board now. We did end up with another Starseer's Telescope. Not really too big of a loss because we've got a pretty solid hand to begin with.
Rescuing people's a hobby of mine. Dragon Strike Blade.
Now the chance that we can wipe this board is actually reasonable. It's not super high, but it's definitely in a reasonable category. We would have been just short from using the Abomination play, but I probably could have actually triggered it using concentration, Abomination, but I mean, why do that when you can just go for lethal? I mean, that's definitely the better way to take the chance. So we took the high risk, high reward strategy. Fortunately, it managed to pay off. I mean, it was basically a 50-50 on that 1-drop spell. That's all we needed to hit to get lethal, and luckily we hit it. If we hadn't, we would have basically just warded up and tried to buy another turn. So we're starting off with a pretty decent hand. I don't mind the Magic Owl too much, although I probably should have decided just to drop it off, but to keep a decent 2-drop against Shadow is usually pretty favourable, especially considering their possible early plays. And of course, we end up with just playing the Vesper anyway, because they don't play any 1-drop. And I can hopefully take advantage of this. So we do end up with the Fate's Hand, not a big advantage. So again, going with the Abomination, it is a nice threat and it is forced removal, so you really can't go too wrong with just playing that out where you can. Even if it's not the strongest card you can currently play at that time. So this does take us to 8. So that means next turn Abomination will trigger unless our opponent kills it now. So we're basically forcing our opponent to have to answer this Abomination immediately. The question is, can they do that? I believe they can do it pretty well, honestly, looking at this. I mean, it does leave one skeleton though for them. Plus the Peacock going down. Not a huge shock, but we have quite a nice hand to really just pick things off casually. And the spell boosting is actually working out just as well. So just in case we draw another card that we could use, we've already got an Abomination which we'll probably end up having to use. But the Abomination plus the Fate's Hand, if we get something else that we want, we're going to have plenty of points to really float into the next, which will be good. Being able to just play out cards is always handy. So Lady Grey was a little bit of a disappointment. I mean, it would have been better if it attacked instead of using Troth, because then at least I could have killed this fairly quickly instead of having to do it in the roundabout manner. But I mean, that's okay. We're still going to get this. We're going to be able to spell boost, which is okay at this point. We're only really spell boosting the Flame Destroyer and the Fiery Embrace anyway. So getting a 4 boost isn't the worst possible outcome from that Evo.
I'll be home soon.
Especially when we consider the fact that we're only 2 cards away from using Abyss. I would have preferred if we were able to use it next turn, but it's still not a bad spot to be. So another Lady Grey, the big Soul Swash, basically not doing great. So we're in a little bit of a tight spot now, because we do have to answer everything on this board as effectively as we can. I did decide to just target the big one, stop them from getting too much heal going on. Was that the right play? Probably not. But it was the one I was willing to take. And of course, Arcus, which is going to absolutely crush us. Definitely not in a favourable position against this player. Trying to come up with a way that I could do something, and turned out that Fiery Embrace was pretty much it at that point. And we just set up our Flame Destroyer and stuff for next turn instead. Especially since we already have the Starseer's Telescope. And so, the games begin. They're going to go face, they're going to get lots of damage, and I'm going to be in some trouble. Especially with Demon Eater. Demon Eater is actually a surprisingly good card for Arcus. I didn't expect it to be that functional when it comes to removing stuff, but considering you get draw and 2 bodies again, it can really allow you to output a lot more damage than just the basic 5 that you can fill the board with. So the Starseer's Telescope is going to do a good job. Unfortunately, I don't end up with another one yet. And I decided to just go completely wide with this board. I mean, if they can answer all these big followers in a single turn, then they really would deserve the win, because having to deal with the amount of stats there, 20 damage in a single turn, is not an easy thing to do by any means. And they've done a fairly good job. This is actually a really nice hand. They're going to knock out pretty much everything here. The only thing that should stay alive is our 4/4. Which, considering we have another Abyss, is actually going to do some nice work. So we are going to be able to just throw some cards down. I was looking for that Mysterian Circle so that I could put up at least a small ward to really block this out. So the 50-50 worked in our favour. Most people were like, oh, you don't really want Mysterian Circle. I quite like that as a card. It does help out. It's just a matter of the luck being 50-50, so sometimes you'll get what the card you need exactly, sometimes you will get the complete opposite. So they're using a lot of these cards. These are all very forceful removal now. They're not going to be able to remove everything. The question is, do they have just enough to remove these one of these 4/4s? If they can remove one of them, they would survive. Lucky for me, doesn't look like that was going to be the case. So overall, I found Abyss Rune a bit of fun. Would I call it the most consistent deck? Probably not. Is it still solid enough to hold its own in the current meta? For sure. Definitely not a top tier deck, but definitely up there as a very solid one for people to run. It's also relatively cheap in regards to cost, as you are only running 5 to 6 legendaries if you are running 3 Abomination at this point, and that's a pretty reasonable cost compared to a lot of other decks that are out there. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe. You'll find the deck list in the description below, and I'll catch you guys next time. See ya.